All right, folks, welcome.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Raquel Garcia, and first and foremost, I am a woman in long-term recovery. And what that means for me is I've not had a drink or misused a prescription drug in over 12 and a half years. I am blessed to be here today as a woman in recovery, being able to do facilitations and workshops at the national level. I'm also a social entrepreneur who runs the first female Black-owned executive director position in a recovery community center in Douglas County, Colorado. So I'm a subject matter expert in housing, peer spaces, motivational interviewing, trauma-informed space, as well as supervision. Thanks for having me here today. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen and Raquel. Thank you all for being here. My name is Ken Craybill. I go by he, him, his. I am one of those people who started working in the homelessness field way back in last century, 1982, in fact, and worked for 18 years in direct service. And one of the things that was very clear to me at the time was that the best practice of the day was basically described as flying by the seat of your pants. We just didn't have the best practices or the kinds of things around trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, and different kinds of case management that have come to the fore since then. So I cut my teeth providing direct service at Downtown Emergency Service Center in Seattle, Washington, which is my home. And then the last 20 plus years have had the opportunity to do more putting together curricula and doing more teaching and training around these various practices that are intended to be specific to working with marginalized populations, particularly people experiencing homelessness. So it's been a great privilege to learn along the way from people like Raquel and Stephen and so many other people as well.
So by the time we're done today, in terms of learning objectives, I'm hoping everybody's going to be able to name the 4 elements of the spirit of whole person care. There was a little bit of noise in the background, sorry folks. Describe the key principles of whole person care, including trauma-informed care and then person-centered techniques to actually engage people who are experiencing homelessness. And then finally, we hope that you'll identify some practical strategies, or at least take some of them away as we do that as well, that behavioral health crisis service providers can incorporate when they're responding to people experiencing homelessness. And with this, let me turn this over again to Ken and have Ken kind of kick us off with the content and get us underway.
So I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear the term whole person care. I think many of us have certainly heard of patient-centered care and of client-centered care. But what I'd like to suggest here is that whole person care is essentially what it sounds like. It's a framework that really is rooted in the best practices for serving people who are far too often mistreated, systemically marginalized, who live with a lot of stigma and racism and sexism and homophobia. And so we really believe that this framework is helpful, if not essential, to meet people where they are with a sense of dignity, respect, compassion, understanding. It's also essential to look beyond, when we're working with people, a specific issue or particular diagnoses, for example, and really understand that there's an intersectionality amongst all of the things that people come to us with, including a lot of systemic issues that we'll talk about in a bit. And so not only do we want to see people, though, through a lens of, what they need and what's not working so well, but also through a lens of what are the strengths and what's the brilliance about this person that they possess through their own skills and strengths and knowledge, but also to see people from a whole person perspective as people who already have a desire to live a life of wholeness, of integrity, of connection, and recognize that we can tap into that and help build that up through the way we approach people. And we do all of that, of course, in partnership with the people we serve. So as we look at this next slide, just to tease out a few more details of that. So one of the things, of course, is that this is a tailored approach that we use based on this profound respect for a person and all aspects of their lives, all of which are wholly interconnected. And of course, since none of us have the capacity to address and be knowledgeable about and competent at assisting people in all ways, it means that we have to understand that it takes a team to work with people, just as we all require what I'd like to call a circle of care that is really this notion that we have all of these people around us, some who we pay and some who we don't, who help address some of these different needs in our lives. And so the same is true for the services we provide. And then this care needs to be coordinated in a way that's brought together in a way that has some kind of coherence to it. One other thing is that we want to just acknowledge that when we do provide this kind of support and service for people that is whole person oriented, that our ultimate aim is to help people live their best lives. And people's best lives as they see it are in fact to live a healthier and happier life. And I realize that this gets covered over many times by trauma, by hardship, by all manner of things. But if we can keep at the center that people are at their very core seeking to live their best lives possible, even when they're practicing and doing things that are less than helpful, I think that's a really valuable whole person care kind of framework to bear in mind.
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you. And just there's a nice way to think about whole person care just from the slide diagram up in front of you. But recognize that whole person care appreciates a person's health and well-being is impacted and often made worse. It's exacerbated by social causes and conditions, and these are things like poverty, poor nutrition, lack of a safe and stable housing, multiple moves, and the sort of disruption that comes with things like that. Certainly incarceration, unemployment, the chronic anxiety of income security. I spent 40 years in that sort of anxious space, and a lot of folks that experience homelessness do as well. And as Ken pointed out, it is tailored, it's unique, it's individualized, and it's community specific. And because of that, it doesn't happen in an instant. Whole person care requires that multidisciplinary team approach, because you need to be in partnership with the individual and not with your organization or the other organizations supporting you. Yes, partnerships there are valuable, but here it's really a partnership with the person you're serving. And it really does take a whole village sort of perspective to provide that whole person care.
Thank you much. Yeah, let's talk about the spirit of whole person care. I always like to think of spirit as like this thing we don't see around everybody that encases all of who we are, right? So what is the spirit of whole person care? Partnership, coming alongside somebody. Acceptance, where people are at, where they want to go, their desires, accepting people and places and things as they are. Compassion, coming in and sitting with somebody, not trying to fix it, but coming alongside and sitting with somebody. And evocation, what do people already know? People used to always want to tell me things. Nobody ever asked me what I thought and felt. Very different, right? So I'm gonna open up a little bit. And oh yeah, thanks, Ken, that we do acknowledge that this is borrowed from motivational interviewing. It's actually one of my favorite things to dive into. Partnership. So I want to encourage some chat in the chat space. I like to see a lively bunch. We'll engage with you there also. But the spirit of whole person care is partnership. So what does partnership mean to you? How does that show up? A collaboration, demonstrating profound respect for the person. Both parties have expertise, right? Like they've got something to offer, I've got something to offer, two people in the room. Dancing rather than wrestling. I always feel like it's this like waltz, right? We get to sway with each other, right? Forward and backwards instead of fighting against each other or somebody trying to control and shove me. Best practices are not done on or to people, but with and for them. So in a collaboration, asking folks what they want for themselves, coming alongside. So what does it sound like? What would partnership sound like in a conversation or working with somebody? Now, would it be all right if we explore? I like to use this as an invitation, right? Instead of walking into somebody's home, maybe I should knock on the door, ask if they're busy. Do they have time? Can I come in? Some questions like, can I get an invitation into the home versus barging in? How do you feel about these things? Tim says, yeah, there's a terrific complementary relationship between peers and clinicians. This is my happy place, right? Knowing my role, especially when it comes to whole person care, knowing that as a peer, I'm here for where you're at now and where you want to get in the future. And then your clinician is here to work on the things that have already occurred in your life. That's where I like to partner when it comes to clinician and peer space. So it would sound like, what is your understanding of? I look forward to working together. How can I best support you in this process? Right, Fabian? Transparency and respect. Richard says partnership to me means partnering with client, finding his or her needs and collaborating with other community partners to meet this person's needs, right? Working in collaboration with.
Another aspect of whole person care, which we'll call acceptance. Acceptance has a number of different component parts to it. We can think of this as several things. One is this honoring of people's inherent value and potential. We can think of it as honoring autonomy, of accentuating strengths, of providing empathy. All of these things are part of this idea of acceptance. And of course, the way we show this is often through words, but also through actions. And so we might say something like, we might not say it in these same words, but to prize people's inherent worth, we might say something along the lines of, wherever you are, we'll meet you where you're at, or we'll work with whatever is going on with you here and now. And it's this idea of meeting people where they are, not where we expect them to be or want them to be, but just this sort of acceptance, which often lays the groundwork for then people beginning to feel a readiness and willingness to consider change in their lives. If they feel like we're acknowledging people where they are, that we're there in solidarity with them, and we're not trying to fix them in any way. We might provide empathy through a phrase like, you're hoping for a better result next time, or this is really frustrating, or it's very complicated. But oftentimes when we can provide a sense of reflective listening, if you will, that begins to tap into people's hopes and aspirations and wishes, that's often a really fruitful conversation that leads from that. We honor autonomy by saying things like, yes, this is a decision only you can make. I can't make it for you. And I will nonetheless walk alongside you as we do this journey together. That took a lot of patience. That's a strength. Or that took a lot of courage to stand up and speak your mind in that situation. So these are all ways that we both verbalize, but we also, we show that acceptance through our mannerisms, through those glances and our eyes, the softness of our eyes, all of those things, right, make a huge difference. And people know very well whether we are judging them or whether we're accepting them. And I'm putting a little quote in the chat box here that I came across not too long ago. Basically, the idea being that when you judge another, you're not defining them, you're defining yourself. So one of the ways of illustrating for you the difference between, of prizing people for their potential On the left, you see an image of a man named Edwin Gibbons, somebody who actually Stephen has met, and I've also worked in Skid Row in Los Angeles. Have done some work there, but this is a man who lived in Skid Row in LA for 20 plus years. And as you look at the image on the left, you can see how he's been beaten down in lots of different ways. Certainly through the environmental kinds of the weather, the racism, the stigma that comes, the discrimination that comes with being poor and on the streets. But you can also see in his body that there's likelihood of substance misuse. There's likely mental health challenges that play here, as well as physical health challenges. The good news in all of this is, and I would just say this, if I were looking at Edwin on the street, I would have a hard time seeing what I would call Edwin's potential. But the beautiful part of this story is that Edwin was given housing first with no conditions. And then he was surrounded by people, a circle of care, and he was given opportunities to think about and reflect on his situation and his life. And he ultimately asked to go to detox and get into treatment. And this is Edwin today, who's an ambassador for Housing First and for all of the good things that happen. Stephen, I don't know, you want to add something to that based on your recollection?
Sure, just really briefly, and it goes back to this idea of acceptance and meeting people where they're at. And I was able to meet Edwin in basically a tour of the original Project 50 model. And this is really what sort of, kind of generated the push forward for for Housing First, after a couple of other large organizations that started this idea about Housing First. Well, when we arrived at this is congregate housing, so there was a set of apartments, single residence occupants, and we were told that Edwin would be willing to let us look at his room, but he really didn't engage with people very much. And don't be surprised if he doesn't say anything to you. Well, like as soon as I saw Edwin and he opened the door, I went right up to him and I started talking to him. And I think he knew instantly, total acceptance. We had a partnership happening. We had similar lived experience. And when that happened, Edwin and I were able to have a very good conversation. He actually took me up to the rooftop that you can see with the LA skyline behind him, showed me his garden, and was talking to me about how these things mattered so much to him today. And there's no way, even a year ago, he would have been able to do any of it. And so what I like to say about Edwin is that as he, you can see that he entered recovery. He's clearly in recovery, but where Edwin is at today, to me, that's executive level recovery. This man is thriving and making things happen for himself. And it was a really powerful experience for me to see how important and how rapidly Housing First made a difference in this man's life. And clearly from the pictures, it made a significant difference. And Ken, thank you for letting me share that. It's important.
And just to say, Stephen, it's thanks to a seasoned outreach worker like yourself in recovery who could connect so easily with Edwin. That's the beauty of peer involvement as well. So
when we talk about compassion, for me, compassion has been one of those pieces where I don't feel like that happened very much. And the reason I share that is because my primary diagnosis and disorder is really on the addiction side. And the punitive approach of how we came at folks who were misusing substances, it was, there wasn't a whole lot of compassion there. And when I think about coming alongside somebody in their suffering and then actively promoting the other person's welfare, giving priority to the needs of that person and not what we think they need, what they tell us they need. And, what does that sound like? Well, let me tell you, I'm going to give you these, the quotes on the screen. But here's what I want to tell you would have sounded like compassion to me. Instead of having somebody tell me, that heroin addiction you have, that's terrible. You're a terrible person for that. And, you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to enter recovery. I need you all to know, none of that made any sense to me. I didn't know what recovery was. And I can tell you, compassion for me at that point, and if you're an outreach worker, this is something that, I hope resonates with you, particularly after this session. Talking to me about recovery in the middle of my co-occurring mental health and opioid addiction didn't work. But what would have been super powerful is if somebody would have come up to me and said, listen, I understand that heroin addiction has a terrible sick, and I've never experienced it, but I've seen it and it looks horrific. And what if I was to tell you that I could make that sick go away forever? Let me tell you, that is compassion, because that person may not have experienced the suffering I'm dealing with, but he recognizes the depth of that suffering that I'm involved in. And what he offered me was it was a compassionate way to end some of that suffering. And so while sometimes we just need to sit with people and let them know we're alongside of them. Sometimes we don't need any words at all. Sometimes, and I do this a lot, I'm just sorry. I'm sorry that this is happening to you. And again, may I just stay here? Sometimes we just need people to, join us in our pain. And this is a great one to check in. What would be helpful right now? And just let it sit there. Let them tell you. And then, I'll check back with you tomorrow. Just listen, I'm going to come by tomorrow. If you need anything, let me know. You can let me know tomorrow as well. Compassion matters. And often, the moment we don't show it, you just reinforce the marginalization, the isolation, the frustration and the hopelessness of folks who believe that nobody cares. This quote from Friar Greg Boyle, it's a book called Tattoos on the Heart. And he says, here's what we seek: a compassion that can stand in awe at what people have to carry, rather than to stand in judgment about how they carry it. And when I think about how we try to make our basic life needs, even in the middle of being, abject poverty, homeless, etc. This is super powerful to remind us that a compassionate approach doesn't see the challenges of the homelessness, but instead, what are the strengths that we can use to help this individual get beyond that? There should be no judgment here. This is honestly, many of us are a couple of paychecks away from homelessness. I know that sounds sort of like a cliche, but especially today, that's really relevant. And you can see the lack of compassion in many of the responses, particularly as homelessness increases. It gets more and more and more punitive, when really it should get more and more and more compassionate. Practicing this compassionate detachment, this is respecting our guests or our, the individual in front of us, their power enough not to rescue them, while we're kind of, putting out our hand of compassion in this sort of in the moment right now. We're not here to rescue people and save them. We're here to support them and help them make, the kinds of decisions that are in their best interest without telling them how to make that happen. And, alongside of that, compassionate detachment is also respecting ourselves enough not to take on the challenges of that individual as our own, and recognizing that when we do that, we've given the person a fish for the day rather than teaching that person to fish for a lifetime. And it matters so much for us to remain compassionate, but to not take on the trauma, honestly, that often accompanies our brothers and sisters who are out there, struggling in homelessness. And the truth is, it's real easy to be vicariously traumatized, particularly for those of us who have some history of lived experience, and then engage with folks who are sharing the challenges that they're facing that we may have faced as well. And there's a lot of pain, a lot of struggle with that, a lot of hopelessness, and unfortunately, a lot of stigma and bias.
We've already talked about partnership, acceptance, compassion, and the fourth of these is evocation, which might sound a little strange to your ears unless you're very familiar with motivational interviewing. But the idea here is in the mindset, the heart set that we bring forward, the attitude set that we want to have when we provide care for people, we want to primarily be drawing from people, inviting them to give voice to things, particularly what's concerning them, but also what their hopes are. And so I know in traditional helping, it's so tempting to see a problem, come up with ideas about what the fix should be, and then to tell people, well, why don't you try this or do that? And we all fall into that many times. We call it the righting reflex sometimes. But what we know from research and experience is that actually people are more likely to listen to their own reasons for why they might change and how they might change and what they might who might help them with that. And so as you can see in this spirit of evocation, we're using our manner and our speech to draw out from people. And so we might ask, if we're meeting somebody for the first time, maybe we're an outreach worker, maybe we're working on a mobile unit, but what would you like me to know? Or what would you like me to know about yourself, but also tell me, what it is that you'd like to know about me, perhaps too, in my role here, right? What concerns, if any, and again, these are just sample responses, but the idea is that we can evoke, we can draw out from people by using well-placed questions, by using reflective statements, by again, just acknowledging that people already have within a well of knowledge and wisdom and hopes and dreams, and that when we can begin to invite them to talk about that, they will likely be forthcoming if we are open and non-judgmental in our approach to them. Yeah, let me just offer you here what I sometimes would call a bumper sticker quote that I think is well worth sort of thinking about and having in our minds whenever we're talking with somebody, meeting with somebody. What if we said to ourselves, instead of this person is an empty vessel that we need to fill somehow with our own knowledge and expertise, what if we said to ourselves, you already have what you need, and together let's go find that. That's a very different mind shift from traditional helping. And I know from my own experience, I've been on the helping end where I tried to get people to change, tried to talk people into changing. But I've learned, hopefully, over the years that I'm much more interested in helping people talk themselves into changing by offering up their own arguments for why, how important it is, how confident they are, all of these kinds of things. So just a cautionary note that we do come with expertise as helping people, but we are not necessarily expert at that person's life and their hopes. And that's where we need to evoke from people, which leads us immediately into this idea of person-centered care. And so what we're going to offer up here for the remainder of our time together is 8 core attributes of whole person care. And this is just kind of a mantra, if you will, of different aspects of whole person care that we think are important. As you can see, it's person-centered, trauma-informed. Can you go back a moment, please? Non-stigmatizing, racially just or racially equitable, housing-focused, recovery-oriented, peer-integrated, and self-compassionate. We might be missing something here, but we think we've got most of it, of what we've got. So we're going to take some time with these. So yeah, let's think person-centered for a moment. So when we say person-centered, I think we're so used to saying that term that we've maybe lost its meaning. But we need to remember that there are reasons why we need to keep the focus on the person themselves. Too often we design service systems that prioritize the needs of the system or the provider or the funder. And yeah, we do squeeze in what's important to the person, but really what we really do need to do is put that person front and center in the middle of the circle. And when we put the person's own hopes and aspirations at the center, it's a different mindset and approach than trying to fix people. Instead, what we want to do primarily, it's not that we ignore deficits and things that need help, but we also want to put ample opportunity or ample focus on what is it you would hope for. And so in real life, in conversation, this might sound like, yeah, I get it. You're really struggling with this and such and such. You know, I'm really wondering, what are some of your hopes? We might also ask, what are some of the values that are important to you? What are some things that you'd love to see different in your life? And so by seeding these questions into our conversation, we're beginning to tap into this person's motivation, if you will, to potentially move on to the extent they're able to do so. This also means that when we're person-centered, that we ourselves have to be very aware of our own biases, which we all have and own, and our own assumptions, our own judgments. We know that our brains are programmed to immediately have a reaction to anybody we see. And it's often based on systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, and more. And we've got to somehow override those immediate reactions of our brain to bring ourselves to the place of, instead of being reactive, being truly responsive to people without, or at least by setting aside the judgment and the bias and assumptions we have. And we do this by partnering with people, like we talked about earlier, acknowledging people's choices, acknowledging that decision-making is something that is primarily in the hands of the person, but we can be there in partnership with them. And so we encourage people to become actively involved in their own lives in terms of the direction of their lives. And, you know, let's face it, too many of our systems have too often required conformity and telling people what to do and standing in line here and doing this and that. And I get it, but anytime we can encourage people and acknowledge that their lives are their own to lead, then we'll get better results. So we have here a little video, and I'm going to introduce it briefly, and then we're going to show it. This video happens to have a star actress in it who's with us today, Raquel. Hi. And she's having a conversation with a man named JC. And this was actually a video that we made to try to portray an example of person-centered care from a motivational interviewing perspective. And it's not scripted whatsoever. It's just something that we set up. Stephen and I witnessed it being made and saw history in the making, we believe. But this is an example, I think, of a beautiful way in which Raquel is using her own lived experience, but also her knowledge and wisdom around MI and coaching and peer work to really take that evoking, partnering, compassionate kind of approach with this person. So we're going to watch it. I'm going to ask you to think of 3 questions so that we can discuss them at the end, and we'll come off, we'll not share screen just for a bit. And I'm going to ask you to do this. What are Raquel's hopes in this video sample? What are the methods that Raquel is using based on your own knowledge and understanding of what the skill set is? And then lastly, what is the outcome in terms of JC and how he responds to the approach that Raquel uses? So let's take a look.
So Ken, I'm about to start this video, and the one thing I just wanted to add to that whole intro is that often when we think about certainly motivational interviewing, many of us have this image of MI being conducted in a fairly rigorous kind of way, with people kind of looking over your shoulder, etc. I want you to see this MI in action in a way that you're likely never have seen before.
Hey girl, what's up? Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. I ain't seen you around here in a minute. What you been up to?
Just trying to make it. I mean, hustling, nickel and diamond. They try to tell me that if I do anything more, I'm gonna probably end up in jail. So it's like, what can I do? It's always kind of like not quite making it.
Just not quite making it.
Yeah.
Well, what is making it? What is making it seem like? Is making it for me is different than making it for you. So what's making it?
Making it. I'd love to be able to take girl home, take girl out like you sometimes. I'd love to be able to ride around in the car like the boys I see all the time, be hollering at the car. I'd like to have a place, instead of sleeping over at somebody's house all the time. My own place, my own stuff. Bumming all the time, bumming. I'm tired of it.
Tired of bumming.
Yeah, girl.
So I'm hearing you ready to level up a little bit, JC. What do you think a girl like me and them girls you want to take out? What do you think they're looking for, JC?
I can't handle it. I already tell you right now. High maintenance. I'm just hoping that I can eventually be able to live like a normal person. I'm tired of the hustle. It's every day, day in, day out, nickel and diamond. I just like to be able to relax, and then I'm sure, people like myself, man, I can pick up a girl here and there. That ain't no big deal.
No. Well, you got some good sales skills, JC. Why don't you apply those a little bit differently, brother?
What do you mean? Like how?
Make some money selling cars one day. There's a lot of things you can do to make money. I tend to used to be a hustler, but now I tend to hustle money a little differently. Not in the way I used to on the street.
Girl, I got some bad paper. I don't know if they'll let me in the damn car place. They probably think I'll be taking their car. Look at me, girl. They won't let me up in there.
There's all kinds of sales jobs you could apply that skill to, JC.
I would talk to me. I can't go in there making no $7.95 or something, what is the damn minimum wage nowadays anyway? It's the same as it was when I was a kid. Shit.
Nah, the minimum wage is up.
Minimum wage out here hustling, nickel and diamond.
Nickel and diamond. Yeah, but I hear you ready to trade all that hustle in for stability. I hear you're ready to trade all that in for what you said was a normal life. So what's that normal life? Is it getting up? Is it running your own schedule? What's that normal life look like for you, JC?
You know, I had a normal job since I was a kid. I think I do newspapers. You know, that was the last time I had a job working for the man. I think it looks like I get up in the morning, shower and shave. There's some other S's in there somewhere, but I basically, you have responsibility. I want to be responsible for myself, but it'd be nice to be able to branch out a little bit. Maybe even one day have a family. I can't get no family out here. I can hardly take care of myself half the time.
That sounds like a beautiful dream, JC. I hear you want to have a family and some stability and maybe a little bit of a rhythm to your life. People call it obedience, but you and me don't like that word. Just a little rhythm, right? A little stability, a little rhythm to your life. Sounds like you're ready for that instead of that like reactive hustle all the time. It's exhausting, it's tiring.
Yeah.
Are you open to education? Would you be willing to try and learn something new?
Are you gonna teach me?
I got people that will. If it ain't me, I'm not a teacher. That's not my role. But I might have access to programs and things like that you could at least start looking into. Curiosity. Curious? I see it in you.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. I mean, you ain't never talked to me like this. I just thought you was out here helping them homeless people. I'm not homeless. I'm not like them. I can at least speak in whole sentences.
Yeah, but you deal certain things, and I deal hope and opportunity in a different way.
Damn, that sounds nice. Hope and opportunity. Well, show me this. Show me what it is you're talking about. I'd be willing to look at it. I'm not making no promise, but if you got something to show me, I'll take some time to look at it.
I got a good friend named Shayna. She runs an organization, and she can help you look into that kind of thing. Look at your strengths and the things that make you you, and see where you can apply the skills you already have to get the life that you want. Is it something you're interested in?
Well, she ain't gonna be like investigating me or nothing like that.
Nah, she's one of us. You'll love her. I wouldn't bring you. I wouldn't drive you. Come on now.
You know what? I like you, so I think I'll go with you. Take me on over there, because I ain't catching the bus over there. I don't know where it is. I ain't catching it.
Yeah, I got you. Come on. Let's go have some coffee. I'll give her a call. She's meet us over at the shop.
Call me out, girl. Coffee? Let's go.
Let's go.
And honestly, I think, Raquel, I'm going to just hand it to you for the moment to tell us what you were hoping for, to shortcut a little bit.
My hope was relationship. That was I was just trying to make connection. I keep it pretty basic. You got to get connection before people are willing to let you in the door. So that's it. I was just hoping to connect to him.
Yeah, and I think others might put in the chat box other things, but the idea is you wanted to figure out or engage with him, but also in so doing, you did some very interesting things that guided the conversation along. And so I'm going to ask all of you in the chat box, what are some of the methods that you saw Raquel or observed her using? So some paraphrasing there of what he said. Absolutely. Yeah, some nice reflective statements, offered some resources and help, made it concrete, made it real. And she was very relational. It just came easy, right? And definitely interested in him. But what I'm so caught by is you didn't go in there with an agenda. You didn't have a script. You didn't have a formula of, oh, I need to ask this and this. You just went with the flow, but it came out of a knowledge of evoking from him. So what do you think's the outcome? What do you think, JC? How is he responding to all of this? I think it's fairly apparent, but how's he feeling? How's he thinking? What's he hoping for maybe as a result of this very brief conversation that occurred? He's actually seems rather hopeful, and he heard Raquel talk. You didn't chastise him for his hustling. Instead, you reframed that as, wow, you got some good sales skills there. What a fabulous thing to say, right? And so he has some hope to achieve goals, and his goals, maybe I want to have a family someday. Maybe I want to just live more chill and have a rhythm to my life, and all of those things. And so, of course, these conversations are just part of the larger conversation that he's having with himself now. But as Stephen pointed out earlier, we can kind of deflate people from feeling motivated to change, or we can create the conditions under which they're seeking and eager to change. And there's this great quote from Madeline Hunter who says, they say that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But I say you can salt the oats. And so helping people be thirsty for change is a lot of this. I'm just going to comment that Raquel really effectively redirected some of the come-ons and the sexism and the judgmentalness towards homeless people and all of that. She didn't make that the center of the conversation. That might be another conversation someday, maybe not, but she kept it focused. And I think that's another really good example. So any other comments from anyone at all?
Well, and just so you know, I heard the hit on, but then if he wanted somebody, then what does that look like? And so using that opportunity to figure out what someone like me or like those girls wanted, pulled up possibility, moved it off of me. I live in a community that does not reflect myself at all. And so, that is where I learned how to do this dance, to be honest. I have a choice in that moment if I want to engage and be confrontational. If my goal is relationship, right? If that is the goal and my purpose for being there, then how am I going to do that? And I take one as it comes in. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, like Stephen says, dance. I'm not going to avoid it. I acknowledge that he said it, but then turning it into in a reframe. I'm also that I'm a peer worker, that I count in this work, right? So I'm allowed to say, look, can I share with you that what you said was offensive to me? I can ask that. I can say, can I share? And usually 99% of the time they will say yes. They will want to hear your share. And then I would share that. I've done that even, and actually as a peer worker, I was working with somebody in transition, a teenage girl in transition, transgender child. That was a different experience for me. And we had permission in the space to correct each other. We gave permission. And so when I would use wrong pronouns, she would get to correct me. It also simultaneously taught her how to use her voice and also corrected me so that we'd learn that from each other. So it's a great place. I think those environments are great opportunities for learning and growth. We don't always have to blow up bridges in those spaces. I try to work really hard and let people process that through. I'll get through that a little bit on this trauma piece, right? How do we process that through clean pain? Talk about that a little bit. So trauma informed, what does it mean to be trauma informed? What does being trauma informed mean to you? And you can put that, you're welcome, Fabian. You go ahead and fill in that chat if you want. What does trauma informed mean to you? Go ahead, and Stephen. To me, trauma informed for me recognizes that almost every single human that I will come in contact with has been through something or been asked to overcome or gone through something. It's the overwhelming demand placed upon the physiological system that results in a profound felt sense of vulnerability and or loss of control. It's empathizing with people, right? To properly utilize empathy and see the struggles through the lens of the client. Right, Juliet? Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And an example for this in my own life was when I was 16 years old. I was part of a murder in Aurora, Colorado. So my friends were murdered at a Chuck E. Cheese. That one event was traumatic, yes. But what came after that, the accumulation of those, on top of each other without being able to maybe regain my feet really set me on a trajectory of self-destruction. And so my senses overloaded my system, and I never got a pause in between traumatic events without guidance and support to get me to process through. And so I did, honestly, what I had seen people in my past do with trauma, which is suck that in and blow it upon people or self-destruct in that manner. And, from my, I have my own experience around my father's trauma, and recognizing what that is. So recognizing, even in the world of COVID right now, guys, everybody is going through something. The last 3 years have been a rough 3 years, and recognizing that we're all going through something. So that's really important to me. So what gets stolen? What gets stolen when traumatic events happen to me? My first traumatic event was when I was 9 years old, and it damaged my trust in women, because my first traumatic event was actually from a woman and not a man or someone else. And so it really has, and even to this day at 44 years old, I'm still working through some of that. What else gets stolen? Our dignity, the ability to respond and react, optimism, things that maybe my life will get better. Look, 3 traumatic events, I'll tell you right now, there wasn't a lot of optimism. Little 19-year-old, 18-year-old me, I had not a lot of optimism. Inner calm, the ability to settle one's own body can be removed. Confidence, self-confidence. What I was there when I was 16 years old, varsity soccer player, I was student body president, all of those things, trauma comes, and all of a sudden, all of my confidence and everything that I thought had disappeared. A sense of lightness of being. Oh gosh, the world seems so heavy for so long. For 16 years, it felt heavy. The belief in goodness of self and others, that was a very long mountain for me to climb and overcome, to think that the majority of humans are actually inherently good and that they want the best for me and their own lives. And an overall sense of well-being, feeling grounded, living in a constant state of flight, fight, and freeze, and doing that for a continuous amount of time leaves, and our body, trauma is trapped in the body, right? So Resmaa Menakem, there's a quote, one of my favorite books right now is My Grandmother's Hands, and it's Racialized Trauma and the Mending of Our Own Bodies and Hearts. Says, years as a healer and trauma therapist have taught him that trauma isn't destiny. I thought it was my destiny. I thought trauma was what my destiny was. The body, not the thinking brain, is where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, and where we process most of what happens to us. So when we see trauma, I always look at it as a manifestation. How does it come up, bubble up in people, whether they're speaking loud, or I've had, dealing with conflict. How does that show up? So this is how it affects a person's engagement in service, right? Especially those going through and who are experiencing homelessness. I had a woman that I was working with for a long time. She had been removed from every program that she had been in because she was a fire spirit. I like to call us, and I say us because I was one. And the ability and opportunity for her to release her fire sometimes, because I used to tell her, I got this big container right here. If you need to release the fire, you can drop that in my inbox or something, and she could let that place go, because I can hold that fire enough for her to be able to process and work through that. So without that, it holds people back. I didn't engage in services. I always thought everywhere I go, I was going to burn somebody. So I avoided services. I didn't want that. Even though we're knowledgeable, I didn't want to blow that upon people. So it can be avoidance due to fear of not being seen and heard, mirrored, taken seriously. People would try to convince me of one way. You have to go this way. This is the way, Raquel. The fear of placing trust in others, being controlled, exploited, abandoned, before anybody told me that I might be able to actually do something with myself. I had 5 psych inpatient visits, of which nobody told me that I actually might have the power within myself to do something different with my life. And everybody told me the piece of paper I should follow that was supposed to help me, that didn't. More comfortable with transactional relationships, difficulty keeping appointments, following up on referrals, following through plans, picking up the phone, Picking up the phone could be a traumatic experience. So it can all be barriers to a person's engagement in services. You know, I run a virtual practice. I'll give you an example of folks that were really stuck being able to leave their homes. And I watched telehealth come into play very big in my community. I'm in a rural community. And, you know, this traumatic experience of being in the home, coming outside of someone's home can be a traumatic experience. And so we see where telehealth plays an important role in meeting people where they're at inside their homes. I've seen that, you know, firsthand. You know, fear of avoidance and appearance and memory. I used to, when I first got sober, my mentor was awesome with me at the time, and I would miss a lot of appointments. And she'd wrap a little accountability in me. She'd say, hey, Raquel, so I know that this is a really big struggle for you. If you can start using your calendar, I'm going to ask that you stay committed to the time. And so I honestly, for the last 10 years, I've used a digital calendar, which it was really supportive to me because I felt like a failure. I felt like I should be remembering everything in my life like people take orders at a restaurant. And so the problem for me is when I couldn't take orders like everybody did from memory at the restaurant and had to write everything down, I felt honestly the word for my head was stupid. And that wasn't it. I needed another way. And so somebody coming alongside me and giving me tools and giving me options really transformed the way I interact.
I am more comfortable and have been with those transactional rather than, you know, personal relationships. And I too struggle. I still struggle to this day around, you know, keeping appointments, showing up on time. Really, you know, I can start a project, but it's difficult for me to, you know, kind of follow through and get it all done. And I know that much of that is related to my trauma, but I also know that some of this is also related to some of my own mental illnesses. And one of the big ones that I think work together a lot with my own trauma is my ADHD. And I just say that because all of these symptoms, the poor decision making, the impulsivity, the impaired working memory, my long-term, and most people with ADHD have good long-term memories. It's that short working memory where I'll forget what we're even talking about in the middle of a sentence. So these are all trauma impacts that then are exacerbated by other pieces of, you know, either mental illness, maybe substance use. It could be, you know, things like this social determinants of health. There's a lot of ways that trauma impacts the way that we're able to engage in services, really to even be seen as a potential to engage in services in the, you know, the old medical model. So, you know, trauma impacts us in ways at times we aren't even aware of, and it is exacerbated, you know, at times by other things that are happening with us. So,
well, and it comes in waves. Like I you know, sometimes I dealt with what I dealt with 10 years ago could be a way 10 years ago that shows up in my life 12 years later, you know. So it's also not, that's why that continuum of care is so important.
yeah, it definitely is not linear. So I want to talk just a second about stigma and being non-stigmatizing, because I can tell you right now that, you know, stigma and bias is one of the main reasons that folks like me don't come in for treatment. And not only do we not come, but there's another type of stigma that's attached to this called courtesy stigma. And courtesy stigma is when stigma that you put on the individual with the issue also gets put on a family member. And it's why family members tend to keep this quiet as well. So what is stigma? Well, it's a composite of this ignorance and prejudice and discrimination. It is judgment and disdain, ostracizing. Basically, stigma separates us from them. Whoever them is, and whatever it is that we're looking at the stigma for, it separates us from them. Persistent myths and misconceptions about behavioral health conditions often, in fact, you can look at this in that punitive way that we come at, the drug situation creates a damaging and corrosive attitude that stigmatize people who actually live with these challenges. And these are, these are things that impact us in ways that it's hard for you to grasp. Here's what I mean. It causes further damage when it does become internalized. And that micro stigma creates barriers and challenges to almost everything that we're asking an individual to do within within the community, basically. Stigma and bias are absolutely two of the most difficult things for us to overcome. And I'll just say that bias is even worse because it happens unconsciously. So when we think about how do we get beyond the stigma? Well, whole person care, because it is an antidote to stigma. It challenges the whole piece of stigma because we're meeting people where they're at. We have some awareness and empathy about the situation the first person is in. It is affirming. It's strengths-based, right? It's non-judgmental. We're not coming at this. We don't care really what's wrong with you. We not want to know what happened to you and how do we support that. So it is non-stigmatizing language, beliefs, and practices. There's a lot of ways for us to reduce and end stigma.
We're going to speak to one that we talked about, person-centered, trauma-informed. Stephen just went over non-stigmatizing. And I want to have a bold conversation about racially just and what that looks like. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'm all working on it. Here we go. Took a minute for that one to come in. Bear with me.
We're going to talk about being racially just and what that looks like. I'm going to leave you here with a little tool for you to work through having courageous conversations. We're going to speak about what it's like to have your truth. What is your truth? Speaking your truth in a racially just environment. How to stay engaged. Equity has to happen before diversity. So let's talk about speaking your truth. Speaking your truth is the inclusivity piece, right? Inclusivity meaning that I get to be present in my truth in my environment. Equity is the prerequisite for diversity. I'll say that again. Equity is the prerequisite for diversity. You know, a lot of people went out and made sure that the palettes were clean. So diversity, we tried that first, right? Everybody became really diverse. And we went out and made sure that all the different people were invited to the table. We did. We tried that part. But we didn't see if everybody got an equal opportunity to eat the same things at the same time at that table. So in order to be diverse, we have got to make sure that equity, that everybody has the same opportunities first before we actually are diverse in any way, shape, or form. There's so many places where I had been used, even myself as a Black woman, been used as a grant opportunity or something like that because of diversity. But what they didn't ask is if I had an equal opportunity for positions and opportunities to speak or opportunities to share my thoughts. And I was not allowed in my community to bring my full self to that table. And I'll tell you right now, the second I started having conversations about race in my area, a lot of those places and the doors were closed on me. So we have to be willing to have brave conversations about race. Look, I'm a Black woman. It's okay if you say it. We don't have to pretend that we don't have differences. You know, we're supposed to celebrate those differences. And that color blindness actually that people speak of is really detrimental. To not act like I am other than I am means you're denying who I am. So having some brave conversations. I am diving into, this is obviously my book right now, but My Grandmother's Hands. Resma speaks about 5 anchors, and I'm going to actually put them here in the chat for you. The 5 anchors that will help support you through having some courageous conversations. If you put them in there, it's called a snap. But basically, we want to soothe. Self-soothing is a natural thing that we do to ourselves when we are approached with something that is difficult to speak about, like race. Right, find some way. I'm a snapper. I'm also a tapper. So I'll find some way if I'm in a come to conversation to soothe myself. The next thing you want to do is notice the sensations and emotions without reacting to them in your body, right? So stay engaged, stay present, experience the discomfort. That's anchor 2. Or number 2. Anchor 3 is accepting the discomfort. Like, this is ucky. I don't like the way it feels. My chest is pounding, right? And sitting with it rather than trying to flee it. And then anchor 4 is staying present. Feel the ambiguity. Oh my goodness, that was going to tongue twist me. And experience the uncertainty. I cannot tell you, until I read this, my life experience is that I experience these things first, and then I have to learn all the terms for what I've experienced. That's what Ken and Stephen helped me with. But what I didn't realize is sitting in a lot of church places, honestly, in an all-white church, is that I had experienced these 5 anchors, and I didn't know that that is what I was experiencing, is how I got through some very uncomfortable conversations, courageous conversations around race and equity in my community. That honestly helped me be able to have these brave conversations in a different level.
All right, thank you so much, Raquel. So we go now to housing focused services. I'm just going to say a few brief words about this, but I will say that when I first started working in homelessness back in the 1980s, this idea of housing first didn't exist. At least it wasn't being put into practice. Although we were sneaking people into housing and not telling people about things. But housing first, of course, is, I hope you all know, is based on 2 core convictions. One being that it is a basic human right. We don't have to prove our readiness for housing, as used to be the case, and it shouldn't be a reward somehow. We know that housing is good medicine, housing is good healthcare, it's good mental health care, and so on and so forth. We also know that there should be a wraparound of good care, circle of care services as well. And so the principles here are basic ones. We have those invitations for people to work on housing before we work on trying to help people get into treatment and all of those things. Potentially, this is if their choice is such. And so we address people's needs, their basic survival needs, through housing without preconditions. Think about Edwin Gibbons once again. He was given this opportunity. The provider was obligated to not make people do things, not require, but to invite people to enter into relationships and services as they were ready. We don't punish people just because they don't do all the things that we want them to do around participation in services. Now, it doesn't say there aren't limits, of course. People do need to abide by a lease and, take care of their place and not burn the place down, those kinds of things, right? But the units are also targeted for some of the very most needed, vulnerable and disenfranchised people, is part of that housing first mentality.
Ken, thank you so much. And folks, one of the additional core attributes is really being, recovery oriented, and essentially, recovery orientation comes at meeting people where they're at. It's strength based, it's person centered, it is trauma informed, and those are the kinds of things I think that, particularly as a person in recovery, didn't have a whole lot of while out in active addiction. And certainly these are the things that help the internal stigma that I deal with become less impactful. It still hits you, but they're less impactful.
This is one of the places I actually love to live. Is in the 4 dimensions of the recovery process. And so one of the first places is health. I like to say health, right? There's all these paces of health. There's mental health, physical health, all of those things, right? Healthy mind, body, spirit. Home, what does that look like? And also keeping in mind of cultural competency here, in what health looks like to you might look different to me. What home looks like to you might look different to me, and keeping that culturally competent, and allowing me or the person you're working with to dictate what that looks like. Community. Wow, you know, I was grateful that my recovery community was great. I really struggled with some of my other community, reconnecting into the community just because of some of the stigma that came with the ending of my use. That was very hard for me to re-enter into community. It was a very public, like made the news type thing. So that's very hard to re-engage in a small town. Think of those rural populations, right? Where small things happen and it's a big thing in a small town. It's really hard to walk back into spaces like that. Even just the grocery store, you guys, just the grocery store. When a town of 2,200 people, everybody knows your business. Those simple places are really hard. And purpose. You know, giving people purpose beyond just not using or not, you know, giving things beyond their current situation, giving, you know, I like this in that Hustler video, I like to deal hope and possibility, right? What is possible and what purpose do we have in our lives? Everybody, I think, has that core. You know, I'm going to share a story. I had one lady I was working with. This is great. Every time she went, she was supposed to do a 9-to-5 job. We had a lot of jobs that were like telehealth or customer service, right? Pick up the phone, hi, progressive, 9-to-5, 9-to-5, 9-to-5. Every time she went for that certainty, we struggled. I mean, we would go from, you know, substance misuse setbacks, then we're, you know, we are experiencing homelessness. But when she was given the opportunity and purpose to create something for herself, I'll tell you right now, she's an amazing, successful real estate agent because everybody had told her for so long, in order to get a home, to maintain her health and have community, it should look like this: 9-to-5, Monday through Friday, suburban home, especially where I live. This was everyone's trying to fit into this cookie cutter. The second she was given an opportunity to create something for herself is where she took off, and she has not experienced setback. So giving purpose to what's possible, not feeding people what they know, is transformable with the people that you work with.
That was fabulous, Raquel. That was just fabulous. You know, we were talking about some guiding principles of recovery, and as service providers, we need to fully immerse ourselves in the principles, and we really need to think about how they might work. So, as you know, as you're thinking about the guiding principles, and I'll get to them in just one second, how might you modify how you're coming at folks, particularly those folks you're serving, to kind of align with the following principles? And let's get through it. Just move us kind of quickly. Please put that in the chat. I'd love to see it, and I think so would everybody else. Plus, you may have stuff that other folks haven't thought about, and you know, all of that is really important. It takes a village. So yes, recovery emerges from hope, and many of us carry the hope for our brothers and sisters who aren't in recovery until they're strong enough to do it again and carry it on their own. It is person driven. It's the only way we recover, and it occurs across a lot of pathways. So if you tell me that broccoli got you into recovery, I'm going to support broccoli peer support. It's just going to be that way. It is holistic. We have to come at the whole person. And you heard Raquel just talked about health, home, community, and purpose. Those 4 domains are key for those of us who want to recover successfully. It is supported by peers, by allies, and by champions, and family members are as much a peer as the person who has the issue. It's supported through relationship and social networks. The recovery community is powerful, and it keeps us from being pulled back into those other communities that we used to spend a lot of time in. It is culturally based, and it is culturally influenced. So it is about cultural competency, cultural proficiency, and importantly, cultural humility. It's supported by addressing trauma, because if we don't do that, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. It involves individual, family, and community strengths and responsibilities. And recovery is absolutely based on respect, because we don't have respect for ourselves when we step into recovery, and we build it through the behaviors that we're learning and the successes that we're having while we're in recovery. This is you.
Yeah, we'll go through it quick. Yeah, peer support. This changed my life. You know, the first time I'd ever seen a Black woman who was sober was the first time I went to treatment. I was 32 years old, and never in my life had seen somebody who had looked like me and my family members, who had overcame something and got to the other side of that and thrive. So peer was really important to me. Go ahead, Stephen. Peer support workers, also called peer recovery coaches or peer specialists, are people in recovery from substance use disorders or mental illness who are trained to use their lived experience skillfully in supporting others on their recovery journeys. Peer support workers bring their own experience of recovery to inspire hope that recovery is possible. They are uniquely positioned to engage people, help them understand and explore options, connect them with community resources, and problem-solve challenges. They walk beside people in their recovery journey and provide validation, multiple forms of support, and self-help education, and link people to tools and resources. Man, you guys, when I got out of rehab, it was me, 3 kids, side of a mountain, drinking husband. That's what I did. No support, nobody to help me figure out resources. Oh, how powerful the peer is. You know, and peer supports the whole person recovery values, right? It gives dignity and respect and sensitivity. I can say, hey, guess what? Me too, right? That is a huge thing when you are coming out of some walls of shame and trying to break through that stigma. Someone else that's made it to the other side gives us hope. Choice. We get to help go back and say what's worked and what's not worked. Safety is kind of easier to maintain when we've got people that we connect with. And access to services, responsiveness. I can help somebody on a Tuesday when they can't get services maybe till Friday. So we offer that additional, we're that link, the little lines that connect all of that. That's who we are as peer support.
Raquel, that's fantastic. And folks, you know, I want to be careful. I know we're at the top of the hour, and we have a couple of additional things to kind of, we had about 2 more slides to move through. This is really around, you know, the whole person care piece and being self-compassionate. I talked a little bit about that previously, and it is really important to be gentle on yourself, to, you know, to look in the mirror and like the person you're looking back at, Jen. You know, have some self-compassion. And my old supervisor used to tell me, Stephen, you know, is anybody, you know, is this an emergency? Is anybody dying right now? No? Then you know what? Take the, you know, don't work Saturday. Have some self-compassion. And grateful for the participation and time everybody spent with us today. Thank you guys so much for being here.